There's a moment in everyone's life when the noise becomes too loud, when the expectations, the opinions, the constant comparisons start to drown out the one voice that actually matters, your own. And most people respond to that noise by doing more talking, more posting, more proving. But what if the answer isn't to be seen more? What if the answer is to disappear? Not forever, not to escape, but to rebuild. Because the truth is, the strongest transformations don't happen in front of an audience. They happen in silence, in discipline. In those unseen hours where no one is clapping, no one is watching, but everything is changing. So imagine this, 7 days. No distractions, no validation, no external noise. Just you facing who you are and deciding who you're going to become. Because when you remove the world, you finally meet yourself. And when you come back, you don't return for attention. You return with clarity, with purpose, with a level of focus that makes you unstoppable. This is not about disappearing from the world. This is about disappearing from who you used to be. Most people don't realize how much noise they're living in until they try to step away from it. It's not just the obvious noise, the notifications, the conversations, the endless scrolling. It's the subtle noise that's far more dangerous. The expectations placed on you by others, the pressure to keep up, the constant comparison that quietly shapes how you see yourself. Over time, this noise becomes so normal that you stop questioning it. You start believing that it's your own voice guiding your decisions, when in reality, it's a mixture of everyone else's opinions echoing in your mind. And here's the problem. When everything around you is loud, your own voice becomes almost impossible to hear. The voice that knows what you truly want. The voice that understands your limits, your strengths, your direction. Instead, you react. You follow trends. You make choices based on what looks good, what feels acceptable, what gains approval. You become busy, but not necessarily effective. You move, but not always forward. Silencing the noise is not about running away from the world. It's about creating enough space between you and the world so that you can think clearly again. Because clarity doesn't come from chaos. It comes from stillness, and stillness is uncomfortable for most people. When things get quiet, you're left alone with your thoughts, and that's something many try to avoid. But that discomfort is where the truth begins to surface. When you remove the noise, something interesting happens. At first, it feels strange. You reach for distractions out of habit. You feel the urge to check, to respond, to fill the silence with something familiar. But if you resist that urge, if you allow the silence to stay, you begin to notice things you couldn't before. Patterns in your behavior, thoughts that repeat themselves, doubts you've been ignoring. And slowly, beneath all of that, a clearer voice starts to emerge. That voice doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It speaks quietly, but it speaks honestly. It tells you when you're off track. It reminds you of what actually matters. It brings you back to your priorities, not the ones the world gave you, but the ones that truly belong to you. And the more you listen to it, the stronger it becomes. This is where real change begins. Not from external pressure, not from motivation that fades, but from internal alignment. When your actions start to match your values, everything shifts. You stop wasting energy trying to impress others. You stop chasing things that don't fulfill you. Instead, you move with intention. You make decisions with confidence, not because they are easy, but because they are right for you. Silencing the noise also forces you to confront the truth about yourself. Without distractions, there's nowhere to hide. You see your habits clearly. You recognize where you've been making excuses. You become aware of the gap between who you are and who you say you want to be. And while that realization can be uncomfortable, it's also incredibly powerful. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you accept it, you can begin to change it. There's a reason why so many people avoid this process. It requires discipline. It requires honesty. It requires you to sit with thoughts that you might not like. But it also gives you something that most people never achieve: self-awareness. And with self-awareness comes control. Control over your actions, your reactions, your direction. In a world that constantly tells you who to be, choosing to listen to yourself is a radical act. It's not easy, and it's not quick. It takes time to separate your voice from the noise. It takes patience to trust it again. But once you do, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but clearer. You know what to focus on. You know what to ignore. You know where you're going, even if the path isn't fully visible. And that clarity changes how you show up, You're no longer easily distracted. You're no longer pulled in every direction. You become grounded, focused, intentional. And people may not understand the shift at first because it doesn't come with announcements or explanations. It comes with quiet confidence, with consistency, with actions that speak louder than words. Silencing the noise is not about isolation. It's about refinement. It's about removing what doesn't serve you so that what does can finally take its place. It's about choosing depth over distraction, purpose over pressure, truth over approval. And when you make that choice, you don't just hear your own voice, you begin to trust it. Most people think they're connected because they're constantly in touch with everyone else. Messages, updates, notifications, conversations that never really end. There's always something happening, always someone to respond to, always something pulling your attention outward. And while it creates the illusion of connection, what it often does is disconnect you from the one thing that actually gives your life direction, your purpose. Because purpose doesn't come from constant interaction. It doesn't reveal itself in the middle of distractions. It requires space. It requires focus. It requires you to step away from everything that's trying to influence you so you can understand what truly drives you. And that's where disconnecting becomes powerful. Disconnecting is not about rejecting people or responsibilities. It's about temporarily removing the influences that blur your thinking. Every time you open your phone, every time you scroll, every time you consume what others are doing, you're feeding your mind with ideas that may not belong to you. You start comparing your journey to someone else's highlight. You start questioning your pace, your progress, your decisions. And slowly, without realizing it, you drift away from your own path. When you choose to disconnect, you're choosing to pause that influence. You're choosing to stop absorbing and start reflecting. At first, it feels uncomfortable because you've become used to constant stimulation. Silence feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels unproductive. But that's only because you've been conditioned to believe that being busy is the same as moving forward. In reality, some of the most important progress happens when nothing around you is demanding your attention. When you disconnect, your mind begins to settle. The constant input slows down, and for the first time in a while, you're not reacting, you're thinking, you're questioning. You're observing your own patterns instead of being pulled into everyone else's. This is where reconnection begins. Not with the world, but with yourself. You start to notice what genuinely excites you, not what impresses others. You start to recognize what drains you, not just what fills your schedule. You begin to understand your own rhythm. When you work best, how you focus, what kind of environment brings out your best thinking. And as this awareness grows, something shifts internally. You stop chasing validation because you no longer need constant confirmation from others. You stop measuring your worth based on external reactions. Instead, you begin to build a sense of direction that comes from within. It's quieter, but it's stronger. It's not easily shaken because it's not dependent on anything outside of you. Reconnecting with your purpose also means facing the reality of what you've been avoiding. When distractions are removed, you can't ignore the things that matter, the goals you've been postponing, the habits that are holding you back, the decisions you know you need to make but haven't acted on yet. Disconnecting forces you to see these things clearly without the comfort of escape. And while that clarity can feel heavy at first, it's also what creates momentum. Because once you see what matters, you can't keep pretending it doesn't. You begin to feel a sense of responsibility toward your own potential. Not because someone else expects it from you, but because you understand it yourself. Purpose is not something you randomly find. It's something you uncover by removing everything that isn't it. And that process requires intentional disconnection. It requires you to say no to certain things so you can say yes to what actually matters. It requires discipline to stay away from distractions, even when they're easily accessible. As you continue this process, your decisions become more aligned. You're no longer pulled by every opportunity or distracted by every trend. You start choosing based on direction, not impulse. You become more selective with your time, your energy, your focus. And that selectiveness is what allows you to move forward with clarity. Disconnecting also changes how you engage when you do reconnect with the world. You're no longer reacting out of habit. You're intentional. You know why you're doing what you're doing. You know what you're working toward. And that sense of purpose becomes visible in your actions. Not through words, But through consistency and direction, in a world that rewards constant availability, choosing to disconnect is often misunderstood. It can look like absence, like inactivity, like stepping back. But in reality, it's a strategic move forward. It's the decision to build a stronger foundation before stepping back into the noise. Because when you reconnect after truly disconnecting, you're not the same person. You're clearer, more focused, more grounded in what matters. And that clarity influences everything. How you think, how you act, how you show up in every area of your life. Disconnecting to reconnect with purpose is not about isolation. It's about alignment. It's about stepping away long enough to understand yourself deeply so that when you return, you move with intention instead of confusion, with direction instead of distraction, with purpose instead of pressure. Most people wait to feel motivated before they take action. They tell themselves they'll start when they feel ready, when the energy is there, when the timing feels right. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But the problem is, motivation is unpredictable. It comes and goes without warning. Some days it's strong, and everything feels possible. Other days it disappears, and even the simplest tasks feel heavy. If your progress depends on motivation, then your progress will always be inconsistent. Discipline works differently. It doesn't ask how you feel. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It operates on commitment, not emotion. And that's why it's far more reliable. Because when you remove feelings from the equation, you remove the excuses that come with them. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop delaying action. You simply do what needs to be done. At first, this approach feels unnatural. You're used to being guided by how you feel in the moment. If you feel energized, you work. If you feel tired, you rest. If you feel inspired, you create. If you don't, you wait. But discipline challenges that pattern. It asks you to act regardless of your mood. It pushes you to show up even when you don't feel like it. And that's where real growth begins. Because the truth is, most meaningful results come from the days when you don't feel motivated. Anyone can perform when they're inspired. Anyone can put in effort when everything feels easy. But the difference between those who stay the same and those who move forward is what happens on the difficult days. The days when you're tired, distracted, or doubting yourself. Those are the moments that shape your direction. Discipline creates consistency. And consistency is what builds momentum. When you show up every day, even in small ways, you begin to develop a rhythm. Your actions become automatic. You no longer rely on bursts of energy to make progress. Instead, you create a steady pace that moves you forward regardless of how you feel. This consistency also builds trust with yourself. Every time you follow through on what you said you would do, you reinforce a sense of reliability. You prove to yourself that your actions are not dependent on your mood. And over time, that trust becomes one of your strongest assets. Because when you trust yourself, you stop questioning your ability to follow through. You stop doubting your commitment. You know that you will do the work even when it's uncomfortable. Discipline also simplifies decision making. When you rely on motivation, every action becomes a question. Should I do this now? Do I feel like it? Is this the right moment? These constant decisions drain your energy and slow you down. But with discipline, the decision is already made. You've committed to a standard, and your role is simply to meet it. This removes hesitation and allows you to focus on execution rather than debate. There's also a level of freedom that comes with discipline, even though it may seem restrictive at first. When your actions are structured, your mind becomes less cluttered. You're not constantly thinking about what you should be doing or when you should start. You already know. And that clarity creates space for deeper focus and better performance. Discipline is not about perfection. It's not about doing everything flawlessly or never missing a step. It's about returning to your commitments again and again, regardless of setbacks. There will be days when you fall short, days when things don't go as planned. But discipline is what brings you back without overthinking, without making it a bigger problem than it needs to be. It also teaches you how to manage discomfort, because discipline often requires you to do things that are not immediately enjoyable. It asks you to push through resistance, to stay focused when distractions are tempting, to continue working when results are not yet visible. And in doing so, it strengthens your ability to handle challenges in other areas of your life as well. Over time, something shifts. The actions that once felt difficult start to feel normal. The resistance becomes weaker. The effort becomes more natural. And what used to require motivation becomes part of your routine. This is where discipline becomes powerful. It transforms behaviors that once felt forced into habits that feel automatic. In a world that constantly emphasizes feeling good, discipline reminds you that progress is not always comfortable. It's not always exciting. It's often repetitive, quiet, and unseen. But it's also dependable. It doesn't disappear when things get hard. It doesn't fluctuate based on external circumstances. Choosing discipline over motivation is not about ignoring your emotions. It's about not allowing them to control your actions. It's about creating a system that works even when you don't feel your best. Because those are the moments that matter most. Those are the moments where progress is either made or lost, and discipline ensures that you continue moving forward. Regardless of how you feel in the moment, most people spend a lot of time trying to highlight their strengths. They focus on what they're already good at, what feels natural, what gets them recognition. And while there's value in that, it often creates a blind spot. Because the areas that truly limit your growth are not your strengths, they're your weaknesses, the habits you ignore, the patterns you avoid, the parts of yourself you don't want to confront. Facing your weaknesses honestly requires a level of courage that most people are not willing to develop. It's uncomfortable to admit where you fall short. It challenges your self-image. It forces you to see the gap between who you are and who you want to be. And that gap can feel overwhelming if you've been avoiding it for too long. But ignoring your weaknesses doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them more control over your decisions. The things you avoid today become the same things that hold you back tomorrow. And over time, those limitations compound. They quietly shape your results, your opportunities, and your confidence. Honesty is where this process begins. Not surface-level honesty, but real, unfiltered self-assessment. Looking at your habits without excuses. Recognizing the patterns that repeat in your life. Asking yourself difficult questions and being willing to accept the answers even when they're not what you want to hear. This kind of honesty requires you to remove the need to protect your ego. Because your ego will try to justify everything. It will tell you that circumstances are the problem, that other people are the reason things didn't work out, that you just haven't had the right opportunity yet. And while there may be truth in some of that, it often distracts from the part you can control, your own actions. When you start taking full responsibility, your perspective shifts. Instead of asking why something happened to you, you begin asking what you can do differently. Instead of focusing on external factors, you turn your attention inward. And that's where growth becomes possible. Facing your weaknesses also means being specific. It's not enough to say you need to improve. You need to understand exactly where the problem lies. Is it your consistency, your focus, your ability to follow through, your tendency to avoid difficult tasks? The more clearly you define the weakness, the easier it becomes to address it. Clarity removes confusion. And when there's no confusion, there's no place to hide. You know what needs to change, and that knowledge creates a sense of urgency. Not pressure from others, but an internal drive to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. There's also a level of humility involved in this process. Accepting that you don't have everything figured out. Acknowledging that there are areas where you need to improve. Letting go of the need to appear perfect and focusing instead on becoming better. This humility doesn't weaken you. It strengthens you because it keeps you open to learning and growth. At the same time, facing your weaknesses doesn't mean criticizing yourself endlessly. It's not about tearing yourself down or focusing only on what's wrong. It's about being objective. Seeing things as they are, not worse than they are, but not better either. It's about accuracy, not negativity. When you approach it this way, your weaknesses become less intimidating. They become areas of focus rather than sources of shame. You start to see them as opportunities for improvement instead of permanent limitations. And that shift in perspective makes it easier to take action. Action is what transforms awareness into progress. Once you've identified a weakness, the next step is to address it consistently, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but through small, deliberate efforts, repeating the right actions until they become part of your routine, gradually replacing old patterns with new ones. This process takes time. There's no quick fix. But each step forward reduces the gap. Each improvement builds confidence. And over time, the weaknesses that once held you back begin to lose their influence. Another important part of this process is accountability. holding yourself responsible for your actions, even when no one else is watching. Not relying on external pressure to stay on track, developing a standard for yourself and choosing to meet it consistently. Because the truth is, no one else can do this work for you. Others can guide you, support you, encourage you, but the responsibility to change belongs to you. And when you fully accept that your mindset shifts from dependency to ownership, facing your weaknesses honestly is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. As you grow, new challenges will appear. New areas for improvement will become visible. And each time you'll be faced with the same choice to avoid or to confront. Choosing to confront them repeatedly is what creates long-term growth. It's what keeps you moving forward instead of staying stuck. It's what allows you to evolve, not just externally, but internally. In a world where it's easy to hide behind distractions and excuses, choosing honesty sets you apart. It brings clarity to your path. It gives you control over your development. And it ensures that your progress is built on a strong foundation, not temporary motivation or external validation. Most people focus on outcomes. They think about the results they want, the success, the recognition, the visible change. And because those outcomes are public, they often feel the need to show their progress while they're still building it. They talk about their plans, share their intentions, and seek validation before anything has actually been created. But the truth is, real progress doesn't come from what you show. It comes from what you repeatedly do when no one is watching. Habits are built in private. They are formed in the moments that don't get attention, in the routines that seem small and insignificant at first. And that's why they're often underestimated. Because they don't feel dramatic. They don't provide instant feedback. They don't come with applause. But over time, they shape everything. When you rely on public accountability alone, you create a dependency on external pressure. You perform when others are watching, but when that pressure disappears, so does your consistency. Your actions become tied to visibility rather than commitment. And that makes your progress fragile because it's based on something you don't fully control. Building habits in private shifts that dynamic. It removes the need for validation and replaces it with self-discipline. You're no longer doing something to be seen. You're doing it because it aligns with who you want to become. This internal motivation is quieter, but it's far more stable. It doesn't fluctuate based on external reactions. It remains steady even in silence. A privacy also allows you to focus without distraction. When you're not concerned with how your efforts are perceived, you can direct all your attention toward improvement. You can make mistakes without pressure. You can experiment, adjust, and refine your approach without the fear of judgment. And that freedom accelerates growth because you're not dividing your energy between doing the work and presenting the work. There's also a level of honesty that comes with working in private. When no one else is involved, there's no one to impress. You're left with your own standards. And that forces you to be real about your effort. You can't rely on appearances or explanations. You either did the work or you didn't. That clarity builds integrity because your actions and your words are aligned without needing external confirmation. Habits themselves are not built through intensity, but through repetition. Small actions, done consistently over time, create lasting change. And those small actions are often easy to overlook. They don't feel important in the moment. Skipping them doesn't seem like a big deal. But the accumulation of those choices is what defines your progress. When you commit to building habits in private, you begin to respect those small actions. You understand that each one contributes to a larger pattern. You stop waiting for big moments to prove yourself, and instead focus on the daily process. You show up, you do the work, and you repeat it, regardless of how it feels or how it looks. This consistency builds momentum. At first, the progress may not be visible. It may feel like nothing is changing, but beneath the surface, your behavior is shifting. Your mindset is adjusting. Your capacity is increasing. And over time, those internal changes begin to show externally. One of the most powerful aspects of private growth is that it creates a gap between perception and reality. While others may see little change at first, you know the work you've put in. You know the discipline you've developed. And when the results finally appear, they seem sudden to others, but they are actually the result of consistent effort over time. This is where the idea of transformation becomes real. It's not a single moment. It's a process that happens gradually, often unnoticed. And because it's built in private, it's not easily disrupted. It's not dependent on trends or external conditions. It's rooted in your behavior, in your routines, in the habits you've developed. Building habits in private also strengthens your ability to stay focused in a world full of distractions. You become less concerned with what others are doing because your attention is directed inward. You're not comparing your progress or adjusting your pace based on someone else's timeline. You're following your own path at your own speed. There's a level of patience required in this process. Results take time. And without external validation, it's easy to question whether your efforts are worth it. But this is where trust becomes important. Trust in the process. Trust in your consistency. Trust that the work you're doing, even if it's not visible yet, is moving you forward. Over time, these habits become part of your identity. They're no longer something you have to force. They become natural, automatic. They shape how you think, how you act, how you approach challenges. And because they were built in private, they are deeply ingrained. They're not easily broken because they weren't built on temporary motivation or external pressure. In a world that encourages constant sharing, choosing to build quietly sets you apart. It allows you to develop without distraction, to grow without pressure, to focus on substance rather than appearance. And when you eventually step forward, you're not relying on potential or intention. You're backed by consistent action, by habits that have been tested and repeated, by a foundation that was built when no one was watching. Most people live inside an identity they never consciously chose. It's built over time from past experiences, other people's opinions, early successes, repeated failures, and the labels they've accepted along the way. You hear something enough times about what you're good at, what you're not, what kind of person you are, and eventually you start to believe it. That belief turns into a story, and that story begins to shape your behavior. The problem is, once that identity feels familiar, it becomes comfortable, even if it's limiting. You begin to act in ways that reinforce it. You make decisions that align with who you think you are, not necessarily who you want to become. And over time, this creates a pattern where your actions are no longer based on possibility, but on expectation. Redefining your identity starts with questioning that story, not accepting it as fixed, but seeing it as something that was built, and therefore something that can be changed. This requires you to separate who you are from who you've been. Your past actions may explain your current position, but they don't have to dictate your future direction. This shift is not just about thinking differently. It's about deciding clearly and intentionally who you want to be, not in vague terms, but in specific qualities and behaviors. What standards do you want to live by? What kind of discipline do you expect from yourself? How do you handle challenges, setbacks, pressure? These questions force you to define your identity in a way that can guide your actions. Once that definition becomes clear, the next step is alignment. Because an identity is not built through words, it's built through repeated behavior. You can't simply say you are something and expect it to become true. You have to act in accordance with it, consistently until it becomes real. This is where most people struggle. They try to adopt a new identity without changing their habits. They want to see themselves differently, but they continue to act in the same ways. And this creates a conflict between intention and action. Over time, that conflict weakens their belief because their behavior is constantly proving the old identity to be true. Redefining your identity requires you to close that gap, to act in ways that reflect who you're trying to become, even when it feels unfamiliar, even when it feels uncomfortable, because at first it will. You are stepping outside of patterns that have been reinforced for a long time. Your mind will resist. It will try to pull you back to what feels known. But this resistance is part of the process. It's a sign that change is happening. Every time you choose the new behavior over the old one, you weaken the previous identity and strengthen the new one. It doesn't happen instantly. It happens through repetition, through consistency, through making the same choice again and again until it becomes natural. Another important part of this process is letting go of the need for immediate validation. When you redefine your identity, others may not see it right away. They may still respond to you based on who you used to be. And if you rely on their recognition to confirm your change, you may lose confidence when it doesn't come. This is why the shift has to be internal first. You have to believe in the change before it becomes visible. You have to trust your actions even when they're not acknowledged. Because identity is not something you prove to others. It's something you establish within yourself. There's also a level of responsibility that comes with redefining your identity. Once you decide who you want to be, you can't continue making excuses for behaviors that don't align with that version of yourself. You become more aware of your choices, more conscious of your actions, and that awareness holds you accountable. This doesn't mean you become perfect. You will still make mistakes. You will still have moments where you fall back into old patterns. But the difference is you recognize it faster. You correct it sooner. You don't let it define you. Instead of seeing it as failure, you see it as part of the process of reinforcing the new identity. Over time, something shifts. The actions that once required effort begin to feel normal. The discipline that once felt forced becomes part of your routine. The mindset that once felt distant becomes familiar. And at that point, the identity is no longer something you're trying to build. It's something you've become. This transformation is not always visible from the outside at first. It happens internally before it shows externally. But eventually, it becomes clear in the way you carry yourself, in the decisions you make, in the consistency of your actions. Redefining your identity is one of the most powerful changes you can make because it affects everything else. Your habits, your focus, your standards, your results, they all follow from who you believe you are. When that belief changes, your behavior follows. In a world that often defines people based on their past, choosing to redefine yourself is a deliberate act. It requires clarity, discipline, and patience. It requires you to let go of old labels and step into something new, even when it doesn't feel fully comfortable yet. But with time and consistency, that new identity becomes stable, grounded, and real, shaping not just what you do, but how you see yourself and what you expect from your own actions. Most people want to come back stronger, but they underestimate what that actually requires. They imagine a visible transformation, something dramatic, something that immediately gets noticed. But what makes someone truly unstoppable is not what people see at first glance. It's the clarity behind their actions, the focus that guides their decisions, the consistency that holds everything together. Clarity is not something you gain by accident. It's something you develop by removing confusion. And confusion often comes from trying to do too many things at once, from listening to too many opinions, from constantly shifting direction. When your focus is scattered, your energy is diluted. You may feel busy, but you're not making meaningful progress. Returning with clarity means knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't. It means understanding your priorities so deeply that distractions lose their influence. You're not constantly questioning your next move. You're not reacting to every opportunity or every challenge. You have a direction, and that direction filters your decisions. This kind of clarity is built during the time when you step away, when you remove external input and give yourself space to think. You begin to see patterns more clearly. You recognize what has been holding you back. You identify what actually